And one. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us in our very special celebration of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander Heritage and History Month with an all-star author talk with authors Kelly Yang, Dan Santat, Helena Kuri, and Lisa Yee, in a conversation that celebrates their artistic achievements, shares their lived experiences and creative missions, and talks about their hopes for our communal future. My name is Bryn Lopez. I'm the manager of Children's Book World in Los Angeles, a lifetime bookseller. Children's Book World has for over 3 decades made it their mission to have every child see themselves reflected on our bookshelves. Our hope is that this recorded panel can be used by you, teachers, librarians, communities across the country who are facing challenges to kids' books, as many of our authors here know about, and anti-Asian violence and prejudice. Our partner, Teach AAPI, has a mission like ours of community building through events in person, virtually, and by sharing resources, they create a space where children, parents, and people who identify with an AAPI culture can find a sense of belonging, confidence, and pride in themselves, and a better understanding of people who may look like them or share a similar background. Today, we're joined by 4 amazing authors that I'm so excited to be able to have here, 4 good friends as well. Kelly Yang, hi Kelly, is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of New from Here, the Front Desk series, including Front Desk, 3 Keys, and Room to Dream. Yes, We Will, which is her newest book, her debut picture book, Asian Americans Who Shaped This Country. And I know you have a picture of it behind, but I'm going to show you, here's your New from Here that is right here. And very exciting for Yes, We Will. And we are also joined by Dan Santat, who's a graduate of the Art Center College of Design. He's published over 100 books for children. He is notable for titles including The Adventures of Beagle, The Unimaginary Friend, which won the Randolph Caldecott Medal in 2015. We love his acclaimed collaborations with author Min Lei, which include Drawn Together, Lift, and his newest book, born just last week, The Blur.
Thank you.
And his graphic novel, The Aquanaut, which is an indie bookstore bestseller. And Dan lives in Southern California here with his wife, 2 kids, and many, many pets. Helena Kuri is a writer of books for kids and the young at heart. Her latest children's book, Rosa Song, will be released on June 14th, and we're going to have an individual author talk for that book as well, which we're super excited by. And also Paper Kingdom, which was a #1 indie bestseller as well. The Turtle Ship, which is a beautiful book. And you have a new book coming out next year, Sora's Seashells, which we're super excited by as well. And then Lisa Yee, who is here. Lisa Yee's debut novel, Millicent Min, Girl Genius, won the prestigious Sid Fleshman Humor Award. Her other novels include Stanford Wong Flunks Big Time, So Totally Emily, and Absolutely Maybe. She's also the author of American Girl's Kanani books. Her newest book, Maisie Chen's Last Chance, is one of her most personal. And real quick, I just want to be able to share a picture of Helena's new book that is coming out. You give me 1 second here, and that is, you can all see Rosa Song, which is coming out. So that's very, very exciting.
Yes,
about
thank
that.
you. Yeah.
Welcome, everybody. How are you doing today?
Doing well. Thanks, Brad.
Good.
Good to see everybody.
It is good to see. Now, one of the things that we all have in common is that we are all born and raised or grown up in Southern California communities, right? And we have that very lived experience of growing up in this place that is very diverse, sort of our own little bubble. And I wanted to talk first about that. What was your childhood like in terms of having a sense of identity and a sense of representation within the community that you grew up in? And how important was that for you as a young person?
Well, I can start. I grew up in Monterey Park, California, which is now predominantly Asian. But when I moved there, when I was 5 years old, first I lived in Silver Lake. It wasn't all Asian, but later, you know, as it became that way, to be honest, as a kid, I wasn't thinking about race at all. I wasn't thinking about that. I was just thinking about, well, these are my friends and everybody looks different. And as I got older, that's when I started realizing, oh, okay, I'm Chinese American, because before it's not something that was top of mind.
Yeah, I had sort of the opposite experience because I was definitely the only Chinese girl in my school, and I remember we were, managing a motel at the time, and the owner's son, who was not Jason, but was another kid, came to me at school because he went to the same school as me, and he said, "You and I cannot ever talk to each other." I was like, "Why not?" And he said, "Because you're the only Chinese girl and I'm the only Chinese boy. And if we're seen talking to each other, everyone's going to think that we like each other. And I totally don't like." I was like, "Whatever, I don't like you either." But it was really obvious that I was different, that was definitely a huge part of my experience, was the fact that I looked different. I spoke English slightly differently, and I wanted to fit in, and to the point where I would brush off some of the things that people would say to me, to my face, that weren't really kind. I would just try to brush it on, sweep it under the rug, pretend it didn't happen. And that ended up being a very hard experience, I think.
I had sort of a mixed experience. I grew up in Koreatown when I was very little, and so I was surrounded by people who looked like me for a while. And then we moved to the suburbs of Los Angeles where nobody looked like me. And, I got the usual racial slurs and also people asking if I was related to Bruce Lee. And I kind of used it to my advantage. Whenever anybody bothered me, I flaunted that I knew Kung Fu or karate, even though I didn't, and they left me alone. So I tried to use it to my advantage, although it was quite difficult at times.
I grew outside Los Angeles. I was in Ventura County. So, if you look at it, you have LA, you have Santa Barbara, and then you have this just really agricultural, white, Christian area, which was Ventura County. And, being Asian in that area, you were definitely a minority. Like I could definitely, count on two hands, the number of Asian friends that I had. I mean, you had your Japanese community, you had your Chinese, you had Vietnamese, Korean, and all these. But, on top of that, I was Thai American. And so with that came just a little bit of feeling like a little bit of an outsider culturally in that respect, because you would go to Chinese, you'd go to Chinese New Year festivals and these Japanese festivals, but then you were like the Thai kid trying to blend in with other Asians, but you weren't necessarily that type of Asian. So that was always a little weird. Also, growing up in the 80s, man, when you reflect about the 80s, we went through quite a bit, because you would watch movies in the 1980s, and pretty much like the Asian community was the butt of all jokes. Look, they're the funny people that you make fun of, and because they talk funny, and they're always holding cameras and things like that. And being an only child, my parents wanted me to blend in and never make a fuss, just try to assimilate and be that thing. And so it was weird, because being an only child, you never had any kind of influence from a older brother or sister or anybody telling you, how you should act. And so a lot of my reference just kind of came from growing up and watching movies and just seeing, Asian people being the butt of jokes. And I honestly thought, is that what my purpose is as an Asian American? Like, I have to be the clown, like it was this really conflicted thing that I had. And so it wasn't until I came to, it wasn't until I came into a city where I met a community of other Asian people, and you realize, oh, if I had grown up here, I would have been a completely different person, So definitely living in a place where you're the only Asian kid, and then the only, Thai kid really had its effect. And there was a period of time where I really had to kind of get to grips and learn to like myself, because there was this feeling of other, and just by the sheer numbers of you versus them, you kind of are pressured to fall into line and like adhere to certain racial jokes just to fit in.
I think it's interesting how a lot of that becomes internalized for you inside your, especially with kids, if you don't talk to your parents or you don't feel like you can let your parents know about what's going on or have someone to be able to communicate those feelings, that sort of feeling of isolation can get internalized a little bit. And you, I mean, you know, you watch those movies in the 80s and you managed to make it through. Mm-hmm. And survive by being able to live in a world that is 90% white faces most of the time. Right. And so it's sort of, I always wonder about, you know, why is it so difficult for people now to be able to accept film or books or stories that feature people that are non-white, you know, that are from different cultures, because we lived it for most of our lives and we managed to survive and become artists or creators or creative people. I don't understand, you know, why it can't work the other way. I want to talk about the beautiful diversity of what it means to be Asian American, that it's not actually just one idea. And that's certainly something that I know a lot of people within the communities face. Helen, you actually talked about that idea about people saying Bruce Lee to you when you were living in Koreatown. But that's one of the beautiful things about that, or the Latino community, or the African-American community, that we're all from different parts of the community, but then we have our own special cultural remembrances as well. Can you talk about that?
You know, you bring up something that's really, I think, important for all of us, which is diversity and representation. And I just love that I'm sitting here on a panel of you know, esteemed artists who've been really exercising your voice. And that's something that I did not see growing up. You know, I didn't see books written by people like us. And so it's so wonderful that now the publishing industry is really pushing for diversity and representation and lived experiences and that sort of thing. And, you know, Lisa, like you, I never really, race wasn't like the prism through which I saw everything growing up. But now that I look back, I realize how much diversity was lacking in the media we consumed, in the books we read back when I was a kid. And so it's almost like a sea change now, what we're seeing in the publishing industry and in the media. I work at Sony Pictures during the day, and you'd be amazed at how much diversity factors into the discussions we have about the movies we're going to put out, the TV shows we're going to put out. So it's amazing. It's really beautiful.
Yeah, I was going to say that, like, when I was growing up, you know, we had our silverware drawer, and there were the knives and the forks and the spoons and the chopsticks. And I mean, it's still that way in my house. But yeah, growing up, I didn't read any books about people who look like me, you know, but the thing is that if it's not there, sometimes you don't know what's missing, especially when you're a kid. And then when you look back and then, like, for example, when I wrote, okay, this whole wall is going to fall down now. When I wrote Millicent Mean Girl Genius, this came out in 2003. And later I was told it was the first time a traditional publisher had a contemporary photo of an Asian kid on a book cover. And to me, 2003 was not that long ago, but we have made such huge strides since then, and still have a long way to go.
Can you remember what was the first book or film or whatever that really gave you, where you saw yourself, where you felt like you saw yourself, someone who maybe an author or somebody who really connected with you?
Gosh, I mean, for me, it was Gene Yang, American-born Chinese. Like, he spoke right to my soul about wanting to just. There's this shame that you have, you know, when you know, your parents really press you to try to fit in and assimilate, and then with that comes the sacrifice of, you know, culture and representation on your own part, and you feel like you kind of let down your people. Like, you feel like, you know, you're less than because you made compromises to fit into this place. And so you're conflicted. And, you know, Gene Yang's book, American by Chinese, I don't know how many times I've read that book, but, you know, like, that's probably one of the best books I've ever read about growing up in America as Asian American.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think also I've experienced that same thing that you have, Dan, in terms of not being, I'm of mixed race. I have many different cultures that I'm part of. And I was really intrigued by your op-ed, Helena, that you had in the LA Times about your experiences during the LA riot with your family, because with your cousin, I felt that experience. You never feel that you're quite enough of other cult when you're mixed, right. That you're not enough of this or enough of that, and it can be very confusing and very isolating, and that never goes away. The feeling that you're just not enough of that particular, to be part of that culture, but you still love them all. Yeah. And that's a major part. Do you want to talk about that story, or the op-ed, because I really was so impressed by it. We will link to it. I don't know if any of you had the opportunity to be able to read Helena's op-ed, but I would love for her to talk about it.
Yeah, thank you, Bren. So the op-ed piece was a way for me to commemorate my older cousin Louise, who was half Black and half Korean. And Bren, exactly what you talked about was something that she experienced her entire life, but I was blind to that because I'm full Korean and I just admired the heck out of her to the point where I wanted to be her. And so I did not recognize that she was going through such difficulty, this identity war within her. Am I Korean? Am I Black? And she eventually, especially after the LA riots, which kind of pitted the two groups against each other, because a lot of Korean shop owners had their stores in Black neighborhoods, and there was just a lot of racial strife between those two groups. I think after that event, she decided, I'm Black, and I'm going to be a Black woman in America. And it was kind of at that juncture where I really felt like our relationship was kind of splintering even further. We never got to have difficult discussions about what the riots meant for us and our family, but little things would come up every once in a while, like she would decline invitations to come to some of our Korean relatives' functions and that sort of thing. And unfortunately, I never got the chance to speak with her about these things and to bridge that gap between us because she died early. So that was a real tragedy for our family. And I wanted to commemorate her memory through that op-ed piece. And, I don't want to put a sad tone right now because ultimately it's a happy story of just the love that we shared and how I think, I don't know how she felt at the end of her life, but I still love the memory of her. And I have fond memories of what we experienced together as kids. So that's what I take away from it, despite the fact that we went through the difficult times together through the LA riots.
I think what it speaks to also is that in this rise of anti-Asian violence that has occurred over the last 2 years in particular, but there really have been this rise in it, is that there is a jump to look at things in a black and white situation of it's this community versus this community or this against that, when really there's so much more, I think, to look at in terms of what's actually happening and why it's actually happening. Can you talk about your personal experiences of watching this type of violence occurring to different people within, communities across the country? What you think about it in terms of what it means for a kid to be able to watch that kind of violence and internalize some of those things that are taking place, and just your general thoughts about it.
I know for me, it was, well, it still is, it's shock. I watched things unfold on the news that I never thought I would see happen in my lifetime. And it was so scary, and I didn't have answers. I just had more and more questions. And I was working on my book at the time, Maisie Chen's Last Chance, which race is a big part of the book. And so I ended up getting writer's block for a long time, but then later channeling things through the book as a way to kind of find some answers for myself too.
Kelly, you had in your book, New from Here, this is a very important part of the story, is, the things that are happening with Knox and his siblings. Can you talk about that and the importance of having that in your book?
Yeah, so there is a thread in the story. I mean, first of all, New from Here takes place at the beginning of the pandemic. This family has, just like mine, decided to immigrate back to the US, having lived in Hong Kong for many, many years. And, the mom sort of thinks she knows everything about America because she grew up here. She's an American, and that coming over will be just like it was for her when she was growing up. And it'll be like a much more tolerant society now because, we're in 2020 when the story takes place. Unfortunately, they are met with some of this anti-Asian hostility. And this is very, very apparent to them from the minute they get off the airplane all the way through to school, when the kids start school, and then even when school, has moved to distance learning, they're experiencing it in the park and so on and so forth. And that mirrors what did happen to my own family. We've had some very uncomfortable situations at the park or at the grocery store. I think a lot of Asian Americans during this time have gone through this, in big and small ways. And it was just really important for me that I document it in this book because it is about the pandemic. And this is a hard reality that a lot of families of color had to go through. There's just no way to write about it without acknowledging that this happened. And also to give kids a way to process and to heal. Because in my family, when this happened to us at the park, we were kind of told to go back to where we came from. I came home and there were many opinions on how to move on from this experience. One kid was like, let's just pretend it never happened. We don't have to ever talk about it. It didn't happen. Okay. And I'm like, no, not okay. Like, it happened. We can't just pretend it didn't happen. Right. Other people wanted to talk about it publicly. I was of that camp. And there are people in my family who are like, why are we talking about this publicly? It's so embarrassing. Let's not talk about this publicly because that will just bring more attention to this issue. And we want to pretend that things are great for you here. I'm like, no, I'm done pretending. Much of my childhood was about pretending that I didn't live in a motel, pretending that I fit in perfectly at school, pretending that I had all these great friends who didn't always say things to me that hurt my feelings. I'm done pretending, now it is a time to acknowledge and to talk about it so that we can heal, so we can reflect and we can make things better for everybody. And so I really wanted to show my own kids, that talking about it is actually a really, really effective way to deal with pain.
So Dan, you have kids that are school-age kids, and you also have been traveling, doing actual in-person book tours where you're meeting actually kids around the country, and many of them in places where they are probably dealing with this even more so than some other communities. What has your experience been in terms of hearing stories from kids or your own personal experience regarding that?
Well, it's interesting. I'll go to certain places like, oh gosh, I remember going to Farmville, Virginia for the Virginia Book Festival, which is, it's headed by a really great person, Juanita Giles, and her big mark is that she wants to spread diversity into a very, very, red area. And so, I remember there, I was, I was in a car, driven by Sandy London, and then it was me and Javaka Steptoe. And, I remember we're in this car, we're driving to the university where the festival is being held, and Javaka's in the back seat, and he stops and he says, "Is that what I think it is?" "Yes, it is." And it was a giant trailer with a huge Confederate flag on it. And I never thought I'd ever see one in my life. And then it was, oh, there's another one. Oh, there's another one. And we realized that we were surrounded by all these Confederate flags. And then I looked at everybody in the car and I said, you guys, you realize like we're the start of some horrible, horrible joke. A gay man, a black man, and an Asian man are all in a car in the South and they're never seen again. And that's the joke. That's like the whole joke. But the thing about Juanita was that the intention was, to bring exposure to these kids who literally have never seen an Asian person before. I mean, it feels weird to think like, oh, I will be the subject of the first time you've ever met an Asian person. I understand the necessity of that to like spread diversity and understanding, but at the same time, it really makes me feel weird saying I am the representative for all Asian people in this country. I don't know if I would have nominated myself for this situation, but you know, here I am, and I try to do the best I can. You know, and that's in a very extreme case where, you know, you go to places and you know, there were situations where I would be playing billiards at like a party, you know, after a book event, and then there'd be people that would come up and they'd want to play the next game because they didn't want you at that table. You know, it's like, okay. And then there were cops like hanging out, and it was a very black and white thing, you know? So here's another example. I remember going down to Mississippi and doing a presentation and not really paying attention to what the Mississippi flag comprised of, and realizing, oh, the Confederate flag is literally weaved into the state of Mississippi. And, you know, going to this event and, you know, meeting a librarian, I was paired up with this Asian librarian. And typically when you meet another Asian person in a place where you least likely expect to see an Asian person like Mississippi, the first thing you ask them is, so what brought you here? You know? Mm-hmm. And she said, my husband has a PhD in philosophy. And if you get a job teaching philosophy anywhere, you take that job because that's the only job you can get with a philosophy major. And I asked her, I said, well, where did you come from originally? And she said, I am from New York, which is probably the most polar opposite of Mississippi that you could ever live. And I said, so how has it been being Asian American growing, you know, living here in Mississippi? And she said, well, the first month and a half, I probably cried every night living in Mississippi. And I said, okay, so do you find yourself, you know, subjugated to racism and things like that? And it was an interesting perspective where she said, you know, what's really deeply rooted in this country is black versus white, you know? And her impression was when you're Asian, you're kind of seen as other, like, oh, wow, oh my gosh, like you're a unicorn or something, like, oh my gosh, there's an Asian person here, you know? And this interaction happened around 2019, before the whole COVID thing happened. I don't know if the perspective has probably changed a lot since then, you know? But at the time, it was like her point of view was, oh yeah, it was very anti-black, anti-white, and then you just had the Asian here. It was almost as if she was living, you know, it's like we have the Capulets and the Montagues, and then we're just those poor people living in the fair Verona, you know, just having to deal with all this crap, you know, like that's kind of the impression that she gave. And so, you know, those have been some of the incidents that I've experienced. And then there was another experience. I remember being in Tennessee for the Knoxville Book Festival in Tennessee. And I remember there was an African-American author, illustrator friend of mine. We were walking to dinner after the festival, and then we walked behind some cops and some police officers. And then he immediately like walked on the other side of the street. And we said, hey, you know, are you okay? What's going on? He's like, yeah, no, we'll just keep walking. I'll meet you at the restaurant, but I'm going across the other side of the street. Afterwards, like we met at the restaurant and we all gathered around. We said, are you okay? What happened? He basically was just like, I don't walk behind cops. And he's the nicest guy, you know, like, and we're like, wow, really? And he's just like, yeah, like I always mind my own business. And there's always been a case where like, I have a problem with cops just because of the color of my skin. And I just don't deal with it anymore. I just don't trust cops. And that's why he was on the other side of the street, you know? And, you know, it's like a real eye-opening experience because, you know, I think we forget sometimes, like I live in California and I live in Los Angeles, very diverse, and it's a bubble. And you go out there and you realize there are struggles that you're not facing because you live in such a diverse community. And so you have to remind yourself of that sometimes.
That's exactly one of the reasons why I wanted to do this panel, which was to really be able to address the fact that there are people living in communities where they're one of a few, or alone, and they're having a sense of isolation. And the biggest issue, and you know, Kelly, you can speak to this, and I'm sure some of you also are on the list. I know Kelly's right on the top of the list for books being censored right now, is that the idea that people can read books about communities or people of different color, of different cultures, of different backgrounds, that are LGBT, that are trans stories, whatever they may be, that by censoring the books, that world will not exist, that it no longer exists just because you banned those books. And what you're all doing with your stories is a beautiful revolutionary warrior type of thing. You're putting these stories out. I mean, how dangerous are your books that they cannot handle them being in their community, because you are basically like a, you know, a bomb that's going to destroy their community if a kid happens to get their hands on your books.
Right.
So Kelly, what you're talk about your censorship experience, because you're having it happen all over the country. I can name 3 places that you've had it happen.
Yeah, no, I mean, sometimes, you know, I try to make jokes about it, but the reality is it's a terrible feeling. It's a demoralizing feeling because, you know, as an author, you put all of your heart, your soul, your lived experience, all your wisdom, all your hopes for the next generation into a book. And in this case happens to be a book that's about me, about my childhood. And somebody says, oh, you know, that book is not suitable to be read. Basically, they're saying your life is not suitable to be acknowledged. That's how it feels anyway. And there's no way to sugarcoat, or, you know, there's no TikTok video we can make that will make that experience less painful. Let's put it that way. It's very painful because I grew up without books like this. I grew up, I think, right before, you know, Millicent Min came along, and I didn't have any book for someone like me, for little Kelly. I just didn't have a book like that. And growing up, that meant that I every day questioned whether we were normal, you know, whether our lives were normal, whether what my parents did was something to be proud of or not to be proud of, or to be hidden constantly, you know, all these secrets. It was exhausting. And I carried this huge weight on my shoulders, much more than any other kid, just for the simple fact that there was no book to acknowledge that I was normal, that I was okay, that it's okay to have my weird, you know, untamable hair, or that, you know, you have parents who show up at PTA meetings and they're talking in English not quite perfectly and grabbing all of the free cookies. You know, all these things are totally normal because there's not one normal American narrative. There's so many American narratives out there. And I just want to remind teachers, you know, that are in situations where you've got parents pushing back or you've got concern, to just remember that we're here for a reason. We're here to prepare the next generation for the future. That is our only job as educators, as authors. That is our job, right? As librarians. And the future is a diverse future. There's nothing you can do to change that, right? So if you take books that are diverse away from kids, you are not preparing them for the future. Right. And that means that we're just not even doing what we're supposed to be doing at school, which is to help give kids more tools, to help them make those bridges and connections, to build up that empathy, to know how to deal with all kinds of people from all kinds of backgrounds. That's what's going to empower them later on in life. So it doesn't feel good, but I am super hopeful for the future. I am super excited that this book, which is the first picture book ever about Asian American heroes, it only took us, you know, however many years, but we did it, 2022. It is today on a billboard in New York City. So I think the future is bright. There is hope, but it really takes a village. It takes all of us working together.
I love what you said, Kelly. I feel a renewed sense of mission and purpose.
Yay!
Yeah.
I think it's so important that all of the because, you know, we talk about the teachers and the librarians, they're criminalizing, they're actually putting it into law to, you know, to make them lose their lifetime livelihood of education. That it's that scary to them, what is inside these books. But by sharing these stories, I'm curious for all of you. We know the impact that it can make on a child in terms of having something that represents your story. But what about kids from other communities, specifically where they're maybe an all-white community, who find a connection to your stories even though it does not look like them. Because I think that's a very important message to send across as well. That's what I think they're more afraid of. That is really what it's about, is that your message connects you some way into their kids' lives in a way that they're not comfortable with.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
So what is that experience like for you of having kids that, you know, maybe are not, you know, that are not really, the story might not have been written for them specifically, but they actually had a really strong emotional connection to those stories?
I've had that happen with a few of my books, like another one. Okay, and I know this wall is going to fall down, but Stanford Wong Flunks Big Time, about this Chinese American basketball player. I got so many letters and talked to so many white young men who said that they identified with Stanford because, you know, he wasn't doing well in school, he had issues with his family, things like that. And the thing was that I think that when we write characters who are well-rounded, the reader will associate with that character, and then an understanding of race or ethnicity or things like that will follow. You don't lead with that, but you have that as part of the fabric of the story. And so when your story as a whole is welcoming and, you know, it's emotive and kids can identify with those characters, they'll see them not as just a, just a paper kind of thing, but as a human being just like they are. And then they can understand more about them and themselves in the process.
I think for me, it's so gratifying, probably the most gratifying, when I hear from readers who don't share my personal experience at all. And they say that something in my story really touched them or moved them. And for me, I think this book, The Paper Kingdom, has been a gift in that way that, that Bren, you were asking about, because I had readers reach out to me saying that they cried or that it made them remember what their parents did for them. And I seek that experience now whenever I write stories. And I'm actually going to be speaking at a school in Compton later this week. And I absolutely wanted to do this school visit because it's a predominantly African-American school. And I know that there are kids there who've never seen an Asian author in person. So I want to do this absolutely because of what we're talking about right now, which is sharing our experiences with people who are so different from us, but connecting on that fundamental human level, because that's what a good story does, right?
And Dan, your books, you want to talk about, because you have a lot of books that I know that, you know, like the Aquanaut, I think is very interesting because it's really, you know, graphic novels are always interesting because they attract, you know,
right.
Every kid loves them.
Typically when I write, I will write about a generalized emotion. So, you know, a book like The Aquanaut, I was reflecting on the passing of my father. So a lot of that came in, and a lot of people can connect to that because there are certain aspects, there are stages of grief that you go through. And one of those stages is just, you know, I mean, at least for me, it was giving up certain habits, you know, because it was habits that you probably learned from your father. You think about little things. You think about little things that are habitual, that are genetic, that are just ingrained in you, that you got from your parents. Like, for example, when I'm really concentrating and I'm focused, I pout my lips. And, you know, that was something that I really recognized that my father would do when he was really focused on something. I will say that there are also certain cases where it's also a very learned experience for me. So a book like Drawn Together was an experience that, you know, I was never comfortable making books about Asian American community because I just never felt like someone who was a good representative for it. Because, you know, you look at people like Grace Lin and others who are they're very pro-Asian. They've been raised to embrace their heritage. And, you know, for me, it was like Thailand didn't really have much to go on. So, for example, I remember going back to Thailand, and I remember struggling, trying to understand why my parents wouldn't let me be an artist. And, you know, you reflect on it and you think, okay, well, what kid would ever like not be nervous about their child growing up and being an artist? It's a very, you know, it's a very tough occupation, you know. But going back to Thailand and realizing that there was no pop culture that was really ingrained in Thailand. You know, like maybe there was a really low form of cinema of them just kind of telling these basic stories. But what I learned was going back to Thailand that there was like anything, any kind of pop culture was imbibed by, you know, the countries around them. You know, my dad grew up being a huge fan of like Elvis Presley and Paul Anka and anything American. And like, if you knew anything about American culture, that gave you street cred in Thailand. You know, I remember going to my cousin's house and he had a PlayStation. He was playing a video game, but the video game was in Japanese. And I said, "What are we doing? Like, how are we playing this game?" And he says, "I have no idea. I don't read Japanese." And I said, "Well, why don't you get a game that's in Thai?" And he says, "Because they don't make Thai PlayStations. Like, you have to work with what you have, you know." And it wasn't until, and I'm really proud to see this, like in the last 15 years, you're seeing a big boom in just culture and representation of Thai, you know, pop culture in terms of music and movies and all kinds of stuff. So I think I was just like an early adopter to like all this stuff. And now you're seeing, you know, Thai people finally embrace that and they're finally kind of getting that. And I think a big part of it was, you know, the introduction of social media and the internet and being able to express themselves and getting outside influence. Because before that, the only people making artwork in Thailand were Buddhist monks. And so when I said that, my parents were like, "Wait, what do you mean you want to make a living as an artist? Can't really comprehend what you're saying." And so, you know, fast forward that years later, working on a book with Min Lay, like a book like Drawn Together, it was therapy for me, really. It was me saying, you know what? I really want to make a book that tailors to a Thai American. You know, Min was very open. You know, he comes from a Vietnamese heritage. You know, and I was thinking to myself, I literally can probably count one Thai book, you know, in American literature. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to take this opportunity. Also, because I'm very well versed in, like, some of the attire and, you know, the fairy tales that go with Thai culture. So I wanted to just I just wanted to pour my soul into it, you know. But as a result, what was really surprising is that you see a whole bunch of other people from other diverse cultures that relate to that story, but not being able to, you know, communicate with their grandparent or their uncle or their aunt who don't speak your language. And for some reason, like, I was in my own little bubble, not realizing, oh yeah, there are other people who came to this country who don't relate to their relatives because of a language barrier. And so, you know, it was eye-opening. It was eye-opening for me as much as it was to anybody else who would read that story.
The universality of that is so interesting because, Kelly, you had a Pandemic Stories project that you did recently, which was so successful, from your page, where you had kids from around the world submitted their own personal stories of their lived experience of the pandemic. And the stories were amazing. How many did you have? 500 that you published on your website.
Yeah.
And then had the great opportunity. We figured it out. And
yes, thank you, Bren. Bren had this amazing idea of letting all these big authors read these stories live to the kids. And I mean, so we got like Jeff Kenny and Stu Gibbs and Jackie Woodson. I mean, a whole bunch of really amazing, you know, all-stars in Kid Lit. And it was such an emotional event. It was so great.
There's something about the idea of the shared experiences. We all live with even within our own cultures, our stereotypes of what a culture is or what that means. And it's so layered and so, you know, diverse in its own way. And then you find out that there's all of these American habits that these other cultures that you think are so specifically this, but they've been watching American TV. So they've adopted all of these things. The beauty of being able to be a part of all of this. We're lucky we live in LA. We're part of all of these wonderful cultures, and we know the difference between Guatemalan food and Nicaraguan food and Vietnamese food or Thai. I mean, we know the little details of it all because we are so lucky to be in that world. I want to ask you all now, as we close up, what is your hope for the future in terms of where we're going, and for, you know, representation within kids' books for AAPI stories? and also for yourself, just your own personal hope for the future. We'll start up with Lisa.
Oh, great. Yeah. Give me the no. Thanks, Brent. No, I think when I was writing Maisie Chen's Last Chance, there was so much hate going on in the world. And I realized, because I was channeling, I was putting there are hate crimes and things like that happen in the book. But I realized that the book is not about hate, it's about hope. And I think the more books, the more stories, the more connections that we can make and put out there, the better the world is going to be for not just us, but our kids and their kids. And it is so important to keep doing that, and to open up stories and to have a dialogue. And like when Kelly was talking about, books that are being banned, if we ban all of these books, we don't have a future. We don't have a future. So we really need to keep the dialogue open, and for all of us, keep writing those books.
Dan?
Oh, well, okay. So I think what we all want progress immediately. I think that's one thing that we can all agree on. But we also understand that the world works, very slowly. So in my perspective, I'm actually very, very optimistic about the future of how things are. Like, take, for instance, let's talk about gender pronouns. Okay, 2 or 3 years, hot topic. No one wanted to talk about it. People were very contested. Now it's just already assimilated in the culture. You already have people saying their pronouns. And, there was a time it probably would have taken years for people to just acknowledge it. But now we've come to a place where that is the new baseline. That is the new baseline. No one contexts the idea of gender pronouns. And it may be the battle that we're fighting right now, but for generations to come, that's the new thing that they just adopt as normal. Okay. So all these seeds that we're planting, as much as we want the immediate change so that we can feel the benefits, that might never come. Okay. But inevitably, for our generations to come, it's going to get better and better for all of them. And, I'm hoping, for me, I'm hoping at my best, I'm hoping that, things are a lot better for my kids. Like I said, we live in LA, so we're kind of in a bubble, but, for future generations, and then their children, and then their children after that. And again, honestly, I'm trying to think about the article that was said. It was like, white America is going to be the minority in around 2041 or something like that. And that's a tide that you can't change. It's going to happen inevitably. You can, they're doing awful things, taking away, abortion rights and things like that, despite the fact that the popular opinion, 70% of the people in this country are for, pro-choice. But it's this small bastion of these politicians that are trying to hold on to this last facet of what they kind of feel, fits their ideology, but I do feel like things will eventually right themselves in the future. I don't know if it's going to happen in our lifetime, but there is this change. That's kind of the nature of the universe. It's entropy, it's always about change. And so we will inevitably get to a point where, hopefully, maybe not in my lifetime, but I am constantly optimistic.
Helena?
Yeah, like Dan, I'm optimistic too. And I'm excited for the output of the authors we have here. And I'm excited for the output of the future Dan, Kellys, and Lisas of the world. And I'm looking forward to the day when our books can be mentioned in the same breath as classics like Goodnight Moon and The Hungry Caterpillar. And I think that day will come.
Oh, that's a beautiful way to put it. Yeah, I hope that people talk about us not just in May. That's my big hope. I hope that people want to learn about API history, because it is American history. It's so rich. There's so many interesting stories. It's riveting. And then we'll be able to organically, teach people that there's no reason to hate, and that we should replace that hate with love and understanding and pride and joy. So that's my great hope. And personally can't wait to see all these creators and in person. And, you know, especially Lisa, I feel like we've talked so many times. I haven't met you in person yet. Helena, same thing. Dan, I see you all the time, so whatever.
We all see Dan.
I, as an independent bookseller for many decades, for 3 decades, I will say this: for teachers, for bookstores, for librarians, if you provide the books and they're there for you, they're being published today. But if you put these great books that you think are as classic as Goodnight Moon or Charlotte's Web or, you know, Trumpet of the Swan, because they are, and you put them on your shelves and not just spined, but faced out, and you allow the opportunity for people to pick up that book and read it, they will do so. They will buy it. They will. Thank God for indie bookstores. We are going to say that over and over again, because they're the reason why this sea change within the publishing industry has happened. They're the ones who forced it to actually happen within the publishing industry, and continue to make these sales happen, because we don't need to have a majority of any population. That's the whole point. The whole point is that we just become one diverse global majority of all of, and I know that's a scary thing for people, but it's a beautiful thing if you've lived it and you've lived that way, and your lived experience of having that sort of diversity in your communities. I cannot thank you all so much. I thank you enough for being here with us. I hope that everyone who's out there watching this and listening to it has had a good experience, and pick up some of their books, which we have on our page where this will be showing. So you can definitely get some of their books, and we have signed copies for people. And thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it, everyone. And I know you're all busy writing, so get back to writing, please. Okay, we're waiting for the next book. Thank you all. Everyone have a great day.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Take care.